Let me start with something that most people misunderstand. Some people don't keep things to themselves because they don't trust anyone. They keep things to themselves because sharing felt more dangerous than silence. At first, it doesn't look unusual. They seem fine, independent, unbothered. They answer questions with just enough detail to satisfy, but never enough to reveal. They deflect concern with reassurance. They change the subject when conversations get too close. And when someone asks if they're okay, the answer is always the same: I'm fine. From the outside, it looks like strength, like privacy, like someone who simply doesn't need what others need. But from the inside, it feels like necessity. People who keep things to themselves are often misunderstood as emotionally guarded, self-sufficient, or impossibly strong. But the truth is usually far more human, far more complicated, and far more exhausting than most people realize. Because keeping things to yourself is rarely about preference. It's about protection. Most of these individuals didn't wake up one morning and decide to carry everything alone. What they did instead was learn, slowly and quietly, that sharing created problems. They learned that expressing needs made others uncomfortable. They learned that vulnerability was met with dismissal, or worse, with the kind of attention that felt like interrogation. They learned that being the person who doesn't complain, who doesn't need reassurance, who handles things quietly, was easier than being the person who asks for help. Over time, this creates a pattern, because when you stop expressing what you're carrying, people assume you're not carrying anything. And that's where something inside them begins to harden. Not into coldness, but into silence. Not into indifference, but into careful distance. They don't stop feeling. They stop sharing what they feel. Because keeping things to yourself is rarely the first choice. It's the only one that felt safe. Most of these people didn't wake up one day and decide to carry everything alone. What they did instead was learn, slowly and quietly, that sharing created problems. They learned that expressing needs made others uncomfortable. They learned that vulnerability was met with dismissal, or worse, with the kind of attention that felt like interrogation. They learned that being the person who doesn't complain, who doesn't need reassurance, who handles things quietly, was easier than being the person who asks for help. And so they adapted. They became the listener instead of the one who speaks, the steady one instead of the one who falters, the person who offers support but rarely asks for it. This didn't happen through conscious decision. It happened through 1,000 small moments where opening up felt like opening a wound. Maybe they shared something as a child and were told they were overreacting. Maybe they cried and were met with irritation instead of comfort. Maybe they watched a parent shut down when emotions got too heavy. Learned that feelings were burdens, not bridges. Or maybe they simply noticed, with the sharp awareness children have, that being easy was safer than being honest. Psychologically speaking, this behavior often stems from early relational experiences where emotional expression was punished, ignored, or minimized. Not always through cruelty, sometimes through simple absence. A parent too overwhelmed to hold their child's fear, a sibling who mocked instead of understood, a friend who shared their secret, teaching them that trust was risky. These moments accumulate, and slowly the mind learns a simple equation. Silence equals safety. Sharing equals risk. Over time, they became the person everyone relied on, the one who listened to everyone else's problems, the one who never seemed to struggle, the one who had it together. And this role, while exhausting, also felt necessary. Because if they weren't useful, if they weren't strong, if they weren't the person who gave instead of asked, then what were they? There's a dangerous assumption that forms in relationships like this. When someone never expresses their limits, people assume they don't have any. When someone always says they're fine, people believe them. Not because others are cruel or unobservant, but because humans generally take each other at face value. And so these individuals end up surrounded by people who have no idea what they're carrying. Not because they're hiding it maliciously, but because they never learned how to set it down. This creates what psychologists call emotional self-reliance carried to an extreme. It's not the healthy independence of someone who can handle difficulty and also ask for help when needed. It's the rigid self-sufficiency of someone who believes asking is failing. They carry grief alone, process trauma privately, solve problems without consulting anyone, and they do this not because they're exceptionally strong, but because sharing never felt like an option. Imagine carrying a backpack that gets heavier each day. At first you adjust. You strengthen your shoulders, adjust your posture, find ways to manage the weight. But the backpack never empties. Every unexpressed emotion, every unshared struggle, every moment you said "I'm fine" when you weren't adds another stone. Eventually the weight isn't just heavy, it's defining. You can't remember what it felt like to walk without it. And here's what makes this particularly painful. Many of these individuals don't even realize how much they're carrying until something shifts. A loss that can't be processed alone. An illness that requires help. A moment where the performance of being fine becomes impossible to maintain. That's when they notice. The backpack has been there so long they forgot it wasn't part of their body. The breaking point doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's just a Tuesday when they realize they haven't had a real conversation in months. Sometimes it's lying in bed replaying every interaction, trying to figure out if anyone actually knows them. Sometimes it's the quiet recognition that they've become unreachable, not because they want to be, but because they don't know how not to be anymore. And by then, something inside them has solidified, not into strength, but into pattern. Not into independence, but into isolation wearing independence's name. They tolerated being misunderstood because explaining felt too complicated. They tolerated being the strong one because being anything else felt like letting everyone down. They tolerated carrying everything alone because asking for help required a vulnerability they no longer had access to. One of the biggest psychological drivers behind keeping things to yourself is something called emotional saturation. It happens when a person has processed too much for too long without external support or validation. The mind becomes so used to handling everything internally that it forgets how to do it any other way. Like a muscle that's only ever contracted, never released. The tension becomes permanent, and eventually they don't just keep things to themselves by choice. They keep things to themselves because it's the only way they know how to exist. One of the biggest psychological patterns behind keeping things to yourself is something called emotional self-containment. It's the practice of processing every feeling, every struggle, every moment of pain entirely within yourself, without reaching outward for support, validation, or even acknowledgement. This isn't the same as healthy emotional regulation. It's the complete internalization of emotional labor that was never meant to be done alone. Emotional self-containment develops when vulnerability has consistently felt unsafe. When someone learns early that expressing emotion creates discomfort, judgment, or abandonment. The mind adapts by creating an internal system that handles everything privately. On the surface, this looks like emotional maturity. These individuals don't spiral publicly. They don't create drama. They don't burden others with their problems. But beneath that composure is an exhausting process of self-management that never stops. The mind wasn't designed to process emotion in isolation. Psychologically, humans are wired for co-regulation. We're meant to share difficult feelings and have them met with empathy, which helps our nervous system return to baseline. We're meant to speak fear out loud and have someone say, quote, 0. That external validation doesn't just feel good, it's neurologically necessary. It helps the brain categorize, process, and release what's been held. But people who keep things to themselves have learned to bypass this entirely. They feel the fear and manage it alone. They experience grief and sit with it privately. They encounter stress and develop their own coping mechanisms without consulting anyone. This creates an internal ecosystem where every emotion is both felt and solved in isolation. And that process is exponentially more difficult than processing with support. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from emotional self-containment. It's not the exhaustion of feeling too much. It's the exhaustion of managing too much. Every emotion requires attention, analysis, regulation, resolution. And when all of that happens internally, without the relief of sharing, it accumulates. Small worries become chronic anxiety. Minor disappointments become deep resentment. Passing sadness becomes persistent emptiness. Not because the feelings themselves are overwhelming, but because processing them alone magnifies their weight. From a neurological perspective, unexpressed emotion doesn't disappear, it gets stored. The body holds what the voice doesn't release. Tension lives in shoulders that carry unspoken stress. Exhaustion settles into someone who processes grief without crying. Insomnia visits those who solve problems alone at 3 a.m. This is why people who keep things to themselves often seem fine emotionally but struggle physically. The body is doing the work the relationships were meant to share. Another layer to emotional self-containment is the invisible labor involved. These individuals are constantly managing their facial expression so no one asks what's wrong, managing their tone so they sound fine, managing their energy so they can still show up for others even when they're depleted, managing their stories so they share just enough to seem open without revealing anything real. This performance takes energy, and it never stops. Imagine holding a ball underwater. At first it's manageable. You can keep it down with minimal effort. But the ball is buoyant. It wants to rise. Over time, your arm gets tired, your focus wavers, the ball keeps trying to surface, and you keep pushing it down, and eventually, the effort required to keep it submerged becomes the only thing you can think about. That's what emotional self-containment feels like. It's not about whether you can hold the feelings down. It's about how much energy it takes to never let them up. And here's what makes this particularly difficult. People who practice emotional self-containment often don't recognize how hard they're working. Because it's been their normal for so long, they don't realize that other people aren't doing this. They assume everyone carries their own weight this way. They assume everyone processes alone, manages privately, holds everything inside, so when someone suggests they open up, it feels less like an invitation and more like a fundamental misunderstanding of who they are. This is why conversations about sharing often feel pointless to these individuals. They've already tried the internal version of every solution. They've already thought through every angle. They've already regulated the emotion as much as possible. What's left to say? From their perspective, talking about it won't change the situation. It will only make them vulnerable without offering relief. And so they stay contained, not because they don't want help, but because they don't believe help exists in the form they need. There's also a quiet pride that can develop around emotional self-containment. These individuals often see their ability to handle things alone as a strength, and in some ways it is. They've developed remarkable internal resources. They know how to sit with discomfort. They can function through pain. They don't fall apart publicly. But strength that's never allowed to soften eventually becomes brittleness. And self-sufficiency that's never allowed to be shared eventually becomes loneliness. What people who keep things to themselves often don't realize is that processing alone isn't processing completely. It's managing, suppressing, containing. But true processing requires witness. It requires speaking something out loud and having another person hold space for it. Without that, emotions circle internally, never fully landing, never fully releasing. They get thought about, analysed, rationalised, but they don't get felt through to the other side. Eventually, holding everything inside doesn't feel like a choice anymore. It feels like the only option that doesn't risk exposure. Because exposure to someone who has learned emotional self-containment feels like vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like danger, so they keep processing alone, keep managing privately, keep containing what was meant to be shared, not because it works, but because it's the only way they know how to survive. Another important thing to understand is that people who keep things to themselves often don't trust partial vulnerability. For them, sharing isn't something you can do halfway. It's all or nothing. Either they're completely closed, or they fear they'll completely fall apart. There's no middle ground where they can share just a little, test the waters, see how someone responds. That kind of graduated disclosure feels impossible. This all-or-nothing thinking comes from experiences where partial sharing backfired. Maybe they opened up slightly and someone probed for more. Maybe they shared one struggle and suddenly became the person with problems instead of the person with solutions. Maybe they let their guard down briefly and felt exposed for days afterward. These experiences teach the mind that vulnerability isn't something you can control. Once the door opens, everything comes through. There's a specific fear that lives in people who think this way. The fear that if they start talking, they won't be able to stop. That if they cry once, they'll cry forever. That if they admit they're struggling, they'll become the person who's always struggling. This fear isn't irrational. For someone who has spent years containing everything, the pressure behind the containment is real. Opening up doesn't feel like releasing a little steam. It feels like cracking a dam. So instead of risking that kind of exposure, they choose complete control through complete silence. They know exactly what they're carrying when they carry it alone. They know they won't say too much, reveal too much, need too much. The boundaries are clear because the boundary is total. No sharing means no risk of oversharing. No vulnerability means no risk of being seen as weak, needy, or broken. This creates relationships that stay perpetually surface level. Not because these individuals don't care about others, but because letting others in feels like losing control of themselves. They can be present for other people's emotions. They can listen, support, hold space. But when it comes to their own emotions, the door stays closed. Not locked with hostility, but closed with quiet firmness. From the outside, this can look like emotional unavailability. But from the inside, it's self-preservation. These individuals aren't withholding to punish anyone. They're protecting something that feels too fragile to expose. Their sense of competence, their sense of stability, their sense of self. Because somewhere along the way they learned that those things only exist when they're held privately. There's also a mathematical quality to how they think about sharing. If silence equals control equals safety, then sharing equals chaos equals danger. The equation is simple. And once it's established, it becomes difficult to challenge, because challenging it requires doing the thing that feels most dangerous, speaking when silence has been safety, opening when closed has been survival, trusting when trust has been repeatedly broken. How do you share just enough without it becoming too much? How do you open the door without everything flooding through? How do you be vulnerable without being consumed by vulnerability? These questions don't have easy answers for someone who has learned to keep everything inside. And so, instead of finding the answers, they stay with what they know. They choose nothing. No sharing. No risk. No exposure. Not because they don't long for connection, but because connection without safety feels more dangerous than isolation with control. And until they find evidence that partial vulnerability won't lead to total collapse, silence remains the more logical choice. There's also a quiet grief that lives inside people who keep things to themselves. Not just grief for the pain they carry alone, but grief for the joy they experience without witness. Because emotional self-containment doesn't discriminate. When you learn to keep the hard things inside, you often keep the good things inside too. They achieve something significant and tell no one. They experience a moment of beauty and hold it privately. They overcome a challenge and celebrate internally. Not because they don't want to share these moments, but because sharing has become so foreign that even joy feels too vulnerable to expose. And so they live a life of unwitnessed moments, where victories feel smaller because they're not celebrated, and struggles feel larger because they're not shared. This grief is complicated. There's relief mixed into it. Relief that they didn't have to perform happiness when they weren't ready. Relief that they didn't have to explain their success or defend their choices. Relief that they kept something pure by keeping it private. But underneath that relief is a deep, quiet ache. The ache of wondering what it would feel like to be truly known. To have someone understand not just the surface version they present, but the full reality of what they carry. People who keep things to themselves often replay moments they almost shared. The conversation where they almost said they were struggling. The celebration where they almost revealed their news. The relationship where they almost let their guard down. These almost moments haunt them because they represent something they both want and fear. Connection. Real, unguarded, mutual connection, where they don't have to be the strong one, the capable one, the one who has everything handled. But each almost moment that doesn't become a real moment reinforces the pattern. Each time they choose silence over speaking, the neural pathway gets stronger. The behavior becomes more automatic. The identity becomes more fixed. Until eventually keeping things to themselves isn't just what they do, it's who they are. And changing that feels like changing their fundamental nature. There's also grief for relationships that stayed surface level, friendships that could have been deeper, family connections that could have been more honest, romantic relationships that stayed emotionally distant because vulnerability felt impossible. These individuals often have people in their lives who care about them, but those people don't know them, not really. Because knowing requires sharing, and sharing requires a level of trust that was never safely established. They grieve the conversations that never happened, the support they never asked for, the moments they could have been held but chose to hold themselves instead. And this grief is particularly complicated because they were the ones who made that choice. They can't blame anyone else for their isolation. They built it. One withheld, truth at a time. One deflection. One I'm fine when they weren't. What makes this grief even more painful is that many of these individuals still remember what it felt like to share before they learned not to. They remember childhood moments of easy honesty. They remember early friendships where everything felt safe. They remember a version of themselves that didn't second-guess every word before speaking it. That version still exists somewhere inside them, but it's so buried under years of self-protection that accessing it feels impossible. So they grieve, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. In moments alone when they notice the distance between who they are and who they present. In moments when they watch others share easily and wonder what that must feel like. In moments when they realize they've lived entire chapters of their life without anyone truly knowing what they went through. The grief is private, like everything else. Because even grieving happens alone when you've learned to keep things to yourself. And here's something rarely talked about. Keeping things to yourself doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it brings silence so thick it feels like drowning. Many people expect that privacy will create relief, that boundaries will create calm, that not having to explain themselves will create freedom. And at first, there is relief. The relief of not performing. The relief of not having to manage others' reactions. The relief of simply existing without emotional labour. But then the loneliness settles in. Because the same walls that keep overwhelm out also keep connection out. The same boundaries that protect privacy also create distance. The same silence that felt like relief starts to feel like absence. And this is when people who keep things to themselves begin to question whether they made the right choice, whether protection was worth isolation, whether safety was worth loneliness. Psychologically, this creates an internal conflict that has no easy resolution. On one side is the need for self-preservation, the very real, very valid need to protect their energy, their boundaries, their sense of self. On the other side is the need for connection, the equally real, equally valid need to be known, to be seen, to share the weight of existence with another human being. These needs aren't compatible in the way they've learned to navigate the world, and so they oscillate, wanting closeness but choosing distance, craving understanding but offering only surface information. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by people who don't know you. It's not the loneliness of being physically alone. It's the loneliness of being emotionally alone while physically present, of sitting in a room full of people who care about you and feeling completely isolated, of having conversations that stay surface level when you're drowning underneath. This loneliness is particularly painful because it coexists with connection. They're not abandoned, they're not friendless. They're just unknown. From a neurological perspective, this kind of isolation triggers the same brain regions as physical pain. The mind registers chronic emotional disconnection as a threat. Loneliness, especially when it's chosen but unwanted, creates stress responses in the body. Cortisol levels rise, sleep becomes disrupted, the immune system weakens, because the body knows something the conscious mind might deny. Humans need connection, not just proximity but genuine emotional intimacy. And keeping everything inside prevents that intimacy from forming. Another consequence of keeping things to yourself is what happens to the things you keep. They don't just sit neutrally in storage, they grow, they mutate. They take up more space than they would if they were shared and processed. A small worry becomes catastrophic when it's only examined internally. A minor hurt becomes a defining wound when it's never discussed. The things we hold privately often become larger than they need to be because they lack the perspective that outside witness provides. This is why people who keep things to themselves often feel like they're overreacting even when they're not. They've spent so long processing alone that they've lost the ability to gauge whether their response is proportional. Is this anxiety reasonable, or am I spiraling? Is this sadness normal, or am I depressed? They can't tell anymore because they have no external reference point, and asking for that reference point requires the very thing they avoid: sharing. Sometimes privacy brings clarity and peace, but sometimes it brings silence so isolating that even thoughts become too loud. And that's when people who keep things to themselves realize that the protection they built has become a prison, not because anyone locked them in, but because they've forgotten how to open the door. Or perhaps they never knew how in the first place. Another key factor is something psychologists call identity fusion. For people who keep things to themselves, emotional self-containment isn't just a behavior, it's who they are. Their identity has become inseparable from being the person who handles things alone. They are the independent one, the private one, the one who doesn't need anyone. This identity feels solid, clear, safe, and challenging. It feels like losing themselves. When someone's sense of self is built around not needing others, asking for help becomes existential. It's not just difficult, it's threatening. Because if they're not the person who handles everything alone, then who are they? If they're not the stable one, the strong one, the emotionally self-sufficient one, then what's their role? What's their value? These questions don't have easy answers, so it becomes easier to maintain the identity even when the identity creates suffering. There's a specific kind of pride that develops around emotional self-sufficiency. Pride that they never burden anyone. Pride that they manage without asking. Pride that they're low maintenance, easy, uncomplicated. And this pride isn't entirely misplaced. These are genuine strengths. The ability to self-soothe, to problem-solve independently, to function without constant external validation, these are valuable skills. But when pride in self-sufficiency becomes identity, it stops being strength and becomes rigidity. People with this identity often receive consistent reinforcement for it. Others praise them for being so independent, so strong, so together. These compliments feel good. They confirm the identity. They make the loneliness seem worth it because at least they're admired. At least they're valued for their self-containment. But these compliments also become cages, because the more someone is praised for not needing help, the harder it becomes to ask for it. This creates a feedback loop. Identity shapes behavior. Behavior gets reinforced. Reinforcement strengthens identity. And somewhere in that loop, the person forgets that identity is supposed to be flexible. That who we are can change based on what we need. That being independent doesn't mean being isolated. But by the time they realize this, the identity is calcified, and changing feels impossible because it requires admitting that the version of themselves they've been presenting, the version they've been praised for, isn't working anymore. There's also fear beneath this identity. Fear that if they reveal they're struggling, people will see them differently. Not as capable, not as strong, not as valuable. Fear that the relationships they have, which are built on them being the stable one, will collapse if they show instability. Fear that they've been valued for their function, not their humanity, and if they stop functioning, they'll stop mattering. This fear isn't paranoid. Sometimes it's based on real experience. Sometimes people do withdraw when the strong friend shows weakness. Sometimes relationships are conditional on someone playing a specific role. But sometimes the fear is projection. Sometimes people would welcome the honesty. Sometimes relationships would deepen with vulnerability. But the person who keeps things to themselves never finds out, because testing the fear feels too risky. So identity remains fixed. Behavior remains unchanged. And the person continues being who they've always been, even when who they've always been is exhausted, isolated, and longing for something different. Because change would mean becoming someone they don't recognize, and that unknown version of themselves feels more frightening than the known suffering of staying the same. When identity and emotional self-containment become one, sharing stops being about a single conversation or a single moment of vulnerability. It becomes about dismantling a core belief about who you are. And that's not work you do in an afternoon. It's work that requires questioning everything you thought made you valuable, everything you thought kept you safe, everything you thought you needed to be in order to deserve love. There's also a subtle perfectionism at play in people who keep things to themselves. They don't just want to share, they want to share perfectly, clearly, without being misunderstood, without being dramatic, without creating burden. They want to express their feelings in a way that's articulate, proportional, and digestible. And since that perfect moment never arrives, they say nothing. This perfectionism operates quietly. It doesn't announce itself, but it's there in every drafted text that's never sent, every rehearsed conversation that never happens, every moment they think about opening up but decide the timing isn't right, the words aren't clear, the emotion isn't processed enough. They're waiting for a version of sharing that feels safe and controlled. But vulnerability, by definition, is neither. The standard they hold themselves to is impossibly high. They believe they need to have their feelings figured out before they can talk about them. That they need to know exactly what they need before they can ask for it. That they need to present their struggle in a way that doesn't inconvenience anyone. These standards aren't just difficult, they're impossible. Real emotion is messy, it's unclear, it's evolving, and if the requirement for sharing is perfect clarity, then sharing will never happen. There's a specific internal monologue that runs in these individuals, not yet. Not like this. Not until I understand it better. Not until I can explain it without crying. Not until I'm sure it's worth mentioning. Not until I've processed it more. These thoughts feel rational in the moment. They feel like healthy self-awareness. But they're actually mechanisms of avoidance disguised as preparation. This is why people who keep things to themselves often wait until crisis to speak. Because crisis bypasses perfectionism. When everything is falling apart, there's no time to craft the perfect explanation. There's no energy to manage how it's received. There's only the raw, undeniable reality that they can't carry it alone anymore. And sometimes crisis is the only thing powerful enough to override the perfectionism that keeps them silent. But waiting until crisis has consequences. By the time they share, the situation has often become much worse than it needed to be. The small issue that could have been addressed early has grown into something overwhelming. The support that could have been gradual becomes emergency intervention. And this reinforces their belief that sharing creates burden. Because when you only share in crisis, sharing does create burden. Not because the feeling itself is too much, but because waiting until it becomes a crisis makes it too much. Perfectionism also manifests in how they imagine others' reactions. They don't just fear being misunderstood, they fear being seen as dramatic, needy, or attention-seeking. They imagine someone rolling their eyes, someone sighing with frustration, someone dismissing their feelings as insignificant. And even if these reactions haven't happened, the fear of them happening is enough to maintain silence. This creates a painful paradox. The more perfect they try to be in their sharing, the less they share. The less they share, the more isolated they become. The more isolated they become, the harder sharing feels, and eventually, the gap between their private reality and their public presentation becomes so wide that bridging it feels impossible. How do you suddenly reveal you've been struggling when you've spent years convincing everyone you're fine? So they continue waiting for the moment when they can share without being vulnerable, waiting for the moment when they can ask for help without needing it, waiting for the moment when they can be honest without being messy. These moments don't exist, but perfectionism doesn't accept that. It just keeps moving the goalpost, ensuring that not yet becomes not ever. If they can't explain it perfectly, they won't say it at all. If they can't be sure it's worth mentioning, they'll keep it inside. If they can't present it without emotion, they'll wait until the emotion passes, which it never fully does. So they stay silent, not because they have nothing to say, but because what they have to say hasn't been refined into something that feels safe to release. From a neurological perspective, chronic emotional restraint creates a protective adaptation in the nervous system. The body learns through repeated experience that sharing equals vulnerability and vulnerability equals threat. This isn't a conscious decision. It's an automatic response developed over years of conditioning. The nervous system has been trained to recognize emotional expression as dangerous, so it activates protective mechanisms to prevent it. When someone who keeps things to themselves considers opening up, their body often responds as if they're facing physical danger. Heart rate increases, breath becomes shallow, muscles tense. The fight, flight, freeze response activates even though there's no actual threat present. This is the nervous system doing its job. It's protecting them based on past data. The problem is, the past data is incomplete. It's based on times when vulnerability led to harm. It doesn't account for the possibility that vulnerability might lead to connection. This adaptation once served a purpose. When emotional expression was genuinely unsafe, when sharing led to punishment or abandonment, the nervous system learned to shut down that pathway. It protected them by making vulnerability feel physically dangerous, and in those circumstances, the adaptation was wise, it was survival. But adaptation without healing eventually becomes limitation. What once protected starts to imprison. The body doesn't distinguish between old danger and current safety. It just knows the pattern. Emotional expression equals activation. Activation equals danger. Therefore, stay silent. This is why people who keep things to themselves often feel physically uncomfortable when they try to share. It's not just psychological reluctance, it's physiological resistance. Their body is actively working to prevent them from doing the thing that their mind knows they need to do. Polyvagal theory helps explain this. When the nervous system perceives threat, it activates defensive strategies. For some people, that's hyperarousal, fight or flight. For others, especially those with histories of chronic relational stress, it's dorsal vagal shutdown, emotional numbness, disconnection. The body essentially goes offline to protect itself. And for people who keep things to themselves, this shutdown often happens preemptively. Before they even attempt vulnerability, the nervous system shuts down the possibility. This is not weakness. This is biology. The nervous system has learned that connection equals overwhelm, so withdrawal becomes regulation. Keeping things inside becomes the way the body maintains equilibrium. And this worked for a time. It kept them functional when everything else felt chaotic. But what worked in childhood or in past relationships often doesn't work in present circumstances. The body hasn't updated its threat assessment. It's still operating on old information. Another neurological aspect is the role of the HPA axis, the body's stress response system. Chronic emotional restraint keeps this system activated at a low level continuously. There's constant internal management happening, constant suppression of the urge to express, to reach out, to share. This creates a baseline of tension that the person might not even consciously notice because it's been their normal for so long, but the body notices. And eventually the body keeps the score. This manifests in physical symptoms. Tension headaches from holding stress without release. Digestive issues from chronic nervous system activation. Insomnia from processing everything alone when the mind should be resting. Fatigue from the invisible labor of constant emotional management. These aren't psychosomatic in the dismissive sense. They're genuine physiological consequences of emotional restraint. The body learned to survive by keeping things contained. And for a long time, maybe even for years, that strategy worked. But the body doesn't know when circumstances change. It doesn't know when safe people appear. It doesn't know when the old rules no longer apply. So it continues protecting the way it always has, through silence, through shutdown, through making vulnerability feel physically impossible. This is why cognitive understanding isn't enough to change the pattern. Someone who keeps things to themselves can know intellectually that sharing would help. They can understand that their current relationships are safe. But knowing doesn't override the nervous system's response. The body has to learn through experience, slowly and repeatedly, that vulnerability no longer equals danger, and that learning takes time. But adaptation without healing eventually becomes isolation. The protective mechanism that once served them starts to limit them. And the body can't tell the difference. It just keeps doing what it was trained to do, which is hold everything inside. At any cost, even when the cost is connection, even when the cost is intimacy, even when the cost is being known. One of the saddest truths about people who keep things to themselves is that many of them deeply want to share. They're not emotionally distant because they don't feel. They're emotionally self-contained because they feel so much that protecting those feelings became necessary. The common misconception is that people who don't share don't care, but often the opposite is true. They care so deeply that the idea of exposing what they care about feels unbearable. These individuals have rich internal emotional lives. They notice everything. They feel intensely. They process constantly. But all of that happens privately, behind a carefully maintained exterior that suggests calm, controlled stability. What others interpret as emotional unavailability is often emotional overwhelm being managed with extraordinary discipline. They're not cold, they're careful. They're not indifferent, they're self-protective. They're not disconnected, they're holding everything so tightly that letting go feels impossible. There's a specific longing that exists in people like this. The longing to be known without having to explain, to be understood without having to perform vulnerability, to have someone see through the facade without them having to dismantle it piece by piece. They fantasize about someone who just knows, someone who doesn't need the explanation, someone who can read what they can't say, because saying it feels like too much. Saying it requires a level of exposure that their entire system is designed to prevent. This is why they sometimes write things they never send. Long messages explaining how they really feel, composed late at night when the loneliness becomes too heavy. They write because the need to express is real, but they don't send because the fear of how it will be received is stronger, so the message stays in drafts. The letter stays in a journal, the truth stays locked inside, and the longing to be known remains unfulfilled. What makes this particularly painful is that the depth of their feelings contradicts the image they project. They appear fine, so people treat them as fine. They seem unbothered, so people assume they are. The gap between internal experience and external presentation becomes so wide that bridging it would require not just sharing, but convincing someone that what they've been seeing isn't the truth. That the person who seems so together is actually falling apart. That takes more energy than many of them have. Research on expressive suppression shows that people who regularly inhibit emotional expression don't feel less. If anything, they sometimes feel more intensely because the emotion isn't being released, it's being held. And held emotion doesn't diminish, it concentrates. It becomes more potent the longer it stays unexpressed. So these individuals are often carrying emotional intensity that would surprise anyone who only knows their carefully managed exterior. They want connection. They want intimacy. They want to be seen for who they actually are beneath the performance of capability. But they've learned that those things come at a cost they can't afford. The cost of being misunderstood. The cost of being seen as weak. The cost of burdening someone with needs they fear are too much. So instead of risking those costs, they protect what they're carrying by keeping it private. Not because it doesn't matter, but because it matters too much to risk. They cry alone. They process losses privately. They celebrate victories internally. Not because these moments aren't significant, but because sharing them feels dangerous. What if the sadness makes someone uncomfortable? What if the joy seems trivial? What if the struggle gets dismissed? These fears aren't irrational. They're based on experience, on times when emotional honesty was met with withdrawal or judgment, on evidence that vulnerability is risky, so they develop elaborate internal systems for managing what they can't share. They talk themselves through fear. They reason with their sadness. They contain their excitement so it doesn't spill over and make others uncomfortable. They become their own therapist, their own support system, their own witness. And they do this not because they prefer it, but because it feels safer than the alternative. The emotional richness trapped inside them is often invisible to everyone around them. They're perceived as even-tempered when they're actually just tightly controlled. They're seen as low maintenance when they're actually just not asking for what they need. They're described as independent when they're actually just afraid to depend. And this misperception becomes another layer of isolation. Because if no one knows what they're carrying, no one can help carry it. They are not emotionally distant. They are emotionally self-contained. They are not cold. They are careful. They are not unfeeling. They are protecting what feels too fragile, too intense, too much to expose. And underneath all that protection is someone who wants desperately to be known, but has no idea how to allow that without feeling like they're coming undone. They want to share. They just don't know how to do it safely, so they stay quiet. Not because they have nothing to say, but because what they have to say is so heavy, so real, so vulnerable, that releasing it feels like risking everything. And when the choice is between isolation that's predictable and connection that's uncertain, isolation wins. Not because it's better, but because it's familiar. And familiarity, even when it hurts, often feels safer than the unknown. There's also often a strong sense of self-awareness in these individuals. They notice things others miss. They observe emotional dynamics with startling clarity. They can sense shifts in energy, read micro-expressions, detect discomfort before it's spoken. This hyper-awareness developed as a survival skill. When emotional safety was unpredictable, learning to read the environment became essential, and that skill has stayed with them long after the dangerous environment has changed. They notice when someone's tone shifts, when someone's smile doesn't reach their eyes, when someone's words say one thing but their body language says another. They notice when their emotions make others uncomfortable, when their presence becomes too much, when they should back off, change the subject, pretend everything is fine. This awareness is both gift and curse. It allows them to navigate social situations skillfully, but it also reinforces their silence. Because when you can see how your pain affects others, sharing that pain becomes harder. They notice the subtle withdrawal, the slight stiffening, the way someone's attention drifts when the conversation gets too heavy. These aren't necessarily judgments on the other person. Sometimes people simply don't know how to hold difficult emotions, but for someone who is hypervigilant, these small signals register as warnings. Stop talking. You're too much. Pull back. Pattern recognition becomes self-fulfilling. They notice discomfort, so they stop sharing. They stop sharing, so relationships stay surface level. Surface level relationships can't hold depth, so when they do consider sharing something real, there's no foundation for it. The relationship hasn't been built to contain that level of vulnerability, and they know it. So they stay silent, not because they're being difficult, but because they're reading the situation accurately. This creates a painful dynamic where emotional intelligence becomes a barrier to emotional honesty. They're so good at reading others that they edit themselves preemptively. They sense hesitation before they've even finished speaking. They feel the burden of their emotions on others before those emotions are fully expressed. And this sensing, this awareness, this clarity about how they impact others becomes another reason to keep things inside. They notice when people ask how they are out of politeness rather than genuine interest. They can tell when someone wants them to say fine, when the question is social ritual rather than authentic inquiry, so they give the expected answer, I'm good, fine, hanging in there. Because they see that anything else would create discomfort neither person wants to navigate. But awareness without boundaries becomes self-censorship. They become so skilled at accommodating others' comfort that they lose touch with their own needs. So skilled at reading the room that they forget they're allowed to change its energy. So skilled at noticing when they're too much that they spend their lives being less emotional, less honest, less present, less themselves. There's also the specific observation that comes from being the person everyone else talks to, but who never talks to anyone. They listen to others share freely. They watch vulnerability happen in real time, and they notice with sharp clarity that what they witness in others is exactly what they can't access in themselves. They can hold space for someone else's pain, but they can't speak their own. They can validate someone else's struggle, but they can't admit they're struggling. This asymmetry becomes another form of isolation. They're close enough to witness intimacy, but not close enough to experience it themselves. They're trusted enough to hear others' truth, but not trusting enough to share their own. And this creates a specific kind of loneliness. The loneliness of being the one who knows everyone's story, but whose story remains unknown. Pattern recognition also extends to their own behavior. They notice when they deflect, when they change the subject, when they perform fine instead of admitting struggle. They're aware of the pattern. They see what they're doing, but seeing it doesn't mean they can stop it. Because stopping it requires vulnerability their nervous system still codes as dangerous. So they watch themselves maintain the pattern, conscious of it, but unable to break it. This is why many people who keep things to themselves describe feeling trapped. Not trapped by others, but trapped by their own awareness. They see the walls they've built. They understand why those walls exist. They even recognize that the walls are limiting them. But knowing doesn't dissolve the walls, it just makes the imprisonment more conscious, more painful, more frustrating. So they notice, they observe, they sense everything. And all of that awareness confirms what they already suspected. Sharing creates risk. Vulnerability creates discomfort. Expressing needs creates burden. And the safest path, the path that protects everyone including themselves, is silence. Not because they want silence, but because they see what happens when silence breaks. And that seeing, that noticing, that hypervigilance keeps them locked inside themselves, aware of everything except how to be free. But here's the thing, keeping things to yourself doesn't stay manageable forever. What begins as protective privacy eventually hardens into something more rigid, more limiting, more isolating. There comes a point where silence stops being a choice and becomes a compulsion, where the pattern becomes so entrenched that even when circumstances change, even when safe people appear, the inability to share remains. This shift happens gradually. At first, keeping things private feels like boundary setting like healthy self-protection. But over time, the boundary becomes a wall. The self-protection becomes self-isolation, and the choice to stay silent becomes an inability to speak. The muscles required for vulnerability atrophy from disuse. The neural pathways that once connected feeling to expression grow weak, and eventually, even when they want to share, they can't find the words. This is when keeping things to yourself becomes dangerous. Not just lonely, but actively harmful. When someone can't ask for help even in genuine crisis. When they hide serious illness, financial collapse, emotional breakdown. When I'm fine becomes so automatic that it continues even when fine is a complete fiction. The performance that once protected them starts to trap them in a version of themselves that no longer matches reality. There are signs this shift has happened. When they physically can't say the words even when they try. When their throat closes. When tears are impossible even in private. When the response to "Are you okay?" is "I'm fine" before they've even processed the question. When deflection happens so automatically they don't realize they've done it until the moment has passed. These aren't conscious choices anymore. They're reflexes. Another sign is when isolation starts to feel normal, when weeks pass without meaningful conversation and it doesn't register as strange. When they realize they have no one to call in an emergency, not because no one exists, but because calling anyone feels impossible. When loneliness becomes so constant it stops feeling like loneliness and starts feeling like personality. Chronic emotional inhibition has measurable health consequences. Higher rates of cardiovascular disease, compromised immune function, increased inflammation, sleep disturbances. These aren't psychological symptoms manifesting physically. They're direct consequences of the biological stress created by long-term emotional restraint. The body can only hold so much for so long before it starts to break down. But the psychological consequences are equally serious. Depression not from sadness but from emotional flatness. Anxiety not from specific fears but from chronic hypervigilance. Dissociation where life feels like it's happening to someone else. These aren't inevitable, but they're common in people who have spent years keeping everything inside without processing or release. The danger is when keeping things to yourself becomes identity instead of behavior. When I'm a private person becomes I am fundamentally incapable of vulnerability. When I handle things alone becomes I am alone. When the pattern becomes so rigid that the person can no longer imagine an alternative. That's when protective silence becomes isolation prison. Some people don't realize this has happened until something breaks. A loss that can't be processed alone. An illness that requires help. A crisis that exceeds their capacity for self-management. And then they discover, often with deep shame, that they don't know how to ask. They've forgotten how to accept support. The very skills they need to navigate crisis have been dormant for so long they're inaccessible. Others realize it gradually, in moments of clarity where they see how isolated they've become, how little anyone actually knows them, how their entire life is performed rather than lived. These realizations are painful because they come with recognition that this didn't happen to them. They created it. One withheld truth at a time. One deflected question. One "I'm fine" that was actually "I'm drowning." And that's when keeping things to yourself stops being a choice and becomes the only option you can see. Not because other options don't exist, but because the pathway to those options has been closed for so long you've forgotten it's there. The door isn't locked, but it might as well be. Because opening it requires the very thing you've spent years learning not to do. Reaching out, speaking up, allowing yourself to be helped. Silence doesn't just protect anymore, it imprisons. Privacy doesn't just create boundaries anymore, it creates walls. And self-sufficiency doesn't just mean independence anymore, it means isolation wearing independence's mask. The shift from protective to problematic happens so gradually that by the time it's recognized, the pattern is deeply entrenched. And reversing it requires not just courage, but the reconstruction of skills that have atrophied from years of disuse. The psychology of people who keep things to themselves isn't about being secretive or distant. It's about carrying questions they've been avoiding their entire life. Questions that live underneath every moment of silence, every deflection, every "I'm fine" when they're not. These aren't abstract philosophical questions. They're deeply personal inquiries that shape how these individuals move through the world. The central question, the one that underlies everything else, is this: can I be accepted as I actually am? Not as the capable version, not as the strong version, not as the version that has everything together, but as the messy, struggling, imperfect version that exists underneath the performance. This question terrifies them because they're not sure of the answer, and not knowing feels more dangerous than never asking. Related questions branch from that central one. Will I be too much if I'm honest? Will people leave if they see me struggling? Will I lose my value if I'm not the stable one? Am I only loved because I'm easy? These questions aren't paranoid. They're based on evidence. Times when honesty created distance. Times when vulnerability was met with withdrawal. Times when needing something changed how they were perceived. There's another question that lives alongside those. Am I allowed to not be okay? This question reveals something fundamental. Many people who keep things to themselves have internalized the belief that struggle is only acceptable in others, not in themselves. They can hold space for someone else's pain. But their own pain feels illegitimate, indulgent, too much. This belief often formed early. Maybe they were the oldest child who had to be mature. Maybe they had a parent who couldn't handle their emotions. Maybe they grew up in an environment where survival required being small, quiet, undemanding. Whatever the origin, the message was clear. Your okayness matters, your not okayness doesn't. So they learned to show up only when they could show up okay, and when they couldn't, they didn't show up at all. Another painful question is, will I disappoint people if I reveal I'm not who they think I am? This question carries particular weight for people who have been performing strength for years. They've built an identity around capability. Others see them as the person who has it together, the reliable one, the strong one. And revealing that this identity is at least partially performance feels like betrayal, not just of others, but of themselves. There's also the question of worthiness. Do I have to earn the right to struggle? They watch others share difficulties that seem smaller than what they're carrying privately. And instead of thinking, I should share too, they think, mine isn't bad enough. Others have it worse. I can handle this alone. The bar for what qualifies as worth sharing is impossibly high. And this bar keeps them silent through situations that clearly warrant support. These questions aren't actively thought every day. They operate more subtly. They're the reasons they change their answer, the reasons they downplay instead of speak honestly, the reasons they minimize their own experience even to themselves. Because if the questions were asked directly and answered honestly, the answers might be too painful to accept. What if the answer is, no, you can't be accepted as you actually are? What if honesty does create burden? What if vulnerability does lead to abandonment? These possibilities feel too risky to test, so the questions remain unasked. The possibility remains unknown, and staying unknown feels safer than finding out the answers might confirm their worst fears. Attachment theory offers some framework here. People with earned, secure attachment learned that needs could be met, that vulnerability could be safe, that relationships could handle difficult emotions. But people with dismissive attachment learned the opposite. That need should be managed alone, that vulnerability equals weakness, that relationships are transactional and conditional. For people who keep things to themselves, the question underneath everything is whether connection requires perfection, whether love is conditional on not needing, whether belonging depends on being low maintenance. And until they test these beliefs in relationships that can prove them wrong, the questions remain, shaping behavior, creating silence, maintaining isolation. The core belief is often something like this: I am only valuable when I am strong. When I'm not strong, I am a burden. Burdens get left. Therefore, I must always be strong, or I will always be alone. This logic is airtight until it's challenged, but challenging it requires the very thing it prohibits: showing up as not strong and seeing what happens. So the question persists: can I be loved, accepted, valued if I'm not the version of myself I've been presenting? If I'm weak instead of strong, needy instead of independent, struggling instead of managing? These questions live in the space between who they are privately and who they are publicly, and the gap between those selves gets wider the longer the questions go unasked. That question doesn't have an easy answer, especially because the answer can't come from thinking. It can only come from testing, from taking the risk of being honest and seeing how it's received, from allowing someone to see them struggling and observing whether that person stays or leaves. The answer is experiential, not intellectual, but it's where healing begins, not in having the answer, but in being willing to ask the question out loud, in risking the possibility that the answer might be yes, that acceptance might be possible, that they could be loved not despite their struggles, but as a complete human who sometimes struggles. That test is terrifying, but it's also the only way forward, because questions that remain unasked keep the person trapped in the assumption that the answer is no, and that assumption, more than anything else, is what maintains the silence, After years of keeping things inside, something unexpected happens. Life doesn't become simpler, it becomes narrower. The world doesn't feel safer, it feels smaller. The silence that was supposed to protect creates its own kind of suffocation. And slowly, what felt like control reveals itself as constraint. Daily life for someone who keeps everything to themselves is an exercise in constant management. They wake up carrying yesterday's unexpressed emotions, last week's unspoken fears, last month's unprocessed grief. All of it accumulates. There's no release valve, no external processing, no moment where the weight gets set down, so it compounds, day after day, until carrying it becomes their baseline and they forget what it feels like not to be heavy. The mornings start with inventory, a mental scan of what they're holding and whether today's version of themselves can hold it convincingly. Can they perform okay today? Do they have the energy to deflect questions? Can they maintain the facade, or is today going to require them to hide entirely? These aren't conscious thoughts. They're automatic assessments that happen before they're fully awake. Conversations become performances, not dramatic performances, but subtle calibrations. How much to share to seem engaged without revealing anything real? How to deflect concern without seeming defensive? How to be present enough that people don't worry, but distant enough that they don't ask follow-up questions? This calibration is exhausting, and most people have no idea it's happening. There are specific moments throughout the day when the gap between internal and external becomes almost unbearable. Someone asks, "How are you?" And for a split second, the truth rises. Not good, actually. I'm really struggling. But before the words form, the pattern activates. I'm fine. Thanks for asking. The truth sinks back down, unspoken, and the moment passes. Or they're sitting with friends, listening to others share easily about stress, relationships, struggles, and they want to join in. They want to say, "Me too. I'm dealing with something similar," but the words won't come. Their throat tightens. The moment stretches, and then someone else speaks, and the moment where they could have shared is gone. These almost moments accumulate like the emotions themselves. Opportunities for connection that don't become connection. Chances to be known that don't become knowing. And each time they choose silence over speaking, the neural pathway gets stronger. The pattern becomes more automatic. The performance becomes more seamless. Until they're not even conscious they're performing anymore. It's just who they are. The physical experience of holding everything inside has texture. Tension that lives in shoulders and jaw. A tightness in the chest that never fully releases. A knot in the stomach that's been there so long they've stopped noticing it. These aren't psychosomatic in the dismissive sense. They're genuine physical manifestations of unexpressed emotion. The body holding what the voice won't release. Sleep becomes complicated. Not always insomnia, but never fully restful. 'Cause the mind is still processing, still managing, still holding. Even in sleep there's work happening. Dreams where they're trying to speak but can't. Where they're reaching out but no one sees. Where they're screaming but no sound comes out. The subconscious doing what the conscious won't. Trying to express what's been contained. There's a specific exhaustion that comes from this way of living. Not the exhaustion of doing too much. the exhaustion of containing too much. Every emotion requires attention. Every unexpressed thought demands management. Every feeling that surfaces has to be evaluated. Is this worth mentioning? Is this too much? Should I share this? And then, inevitably, no. Keep it inside. The constant decision-making, the constant suppression, it's depleting in ways that are hard to explain. They go through major life events entirely alone. A health scare they mention to no one. A job loss they process privately. A relationship ending that they grieve in silence. Not because these things aren't significant, but because sharing them would require explaining. And explaining requires energy they don't have. So they handle it alone, like they handle everything, and the world never knows what they survived. There are moments when they almost call someone, they pull up a contact. They stare at the phone, they imagine conversation. But then the questions arise. What would I say? Where would I start? What if they don't understand? What if it's too much? What if I can't stop once I start? So they don't call. They put the phone down and they continue carrying it alone. Text messages get drafted and deleted. Long explanations of how they're actually doing. Admissions of struggle. Requests for support. They write them at 2 a.m. when the loneliness peaks, when holding everything feels impossible. But morning comes, and morning brings rational thought. And rational thought says, don't send that. You'll regret it. It's too much. You're fine, and the message stays unsent. Another moment of almost sharing that becomes another moment of silence. They watch others live openly. Others who share struggles casually, who ask for help without agonizing over it, who seem to move through vulnerability like it's not dangerous, and they feel both envy and bewilderment. How do they do that? How do they share without fear? How do they need without shame? The skill seems impossible, foreign. Like watching someone speak a language they don't understand. There are good days where the isolation feels manageable, where solitude feels like peace instead of loneliness, where holding everything inside feels like strength instead of survival. But those days are temporary. Eventually the weight returns. The loneliness surfaces, and they remember why this way of living is unsustainable even if it's all they know. The paradox is that they're surrounded by people who care about them. They have relationships, they have friends, they have family, but none of those people know them. Not really, because knowing requires being known, and being known requires sharing. And sharing is the thing they can't do. So they exist in proximity to connection without experiencing it, present but unseen, cared for but unknown, and so they live in 2 worlds, the one where they appear fine, capable, together, the one everyone sees, and the one where they carry everything alone, exhausted, struggling, the one only they inhabit, and the distance between those worlds grows wider every day, until they're not sure which world is real anymore, or if either of them is. Another consequence that develops over time is something called emotional muting. When you spend years suppressing difficult emotions, something strange happens. You don't just suppress the difficult ones. You suppress all of them. The brain doesn't have separate pathways for different emotions. When you close the door on pain, you also close it on joy. When you contain sadness, you also contain excitement. Emotional suppression isn't selective. It's comprehensive. This is why people who keep things to themselves often describe feeling emotionally flat. Not depressed exactly. Not numb in the way numbness is usually described, but muted, like watching life through glass, like feeling emotions from a distance rather than experiencing them directly. They're still there, the feelings, but they're dulled, softened, less immediate. At first, this flatness can feel like relief. Less emotional volatility means less risk of losing control. Less intensity means less vulnerability. But over time, the relief transforms into something more unsettling. Because life without emotional intensity isn't peaceful. It's hollow. Manageable, yes, but hollow. They achieve something significant and the joy is muted. They should feel proud, excited, celebratory, but instead there's just acknowledgement. Yeah, that's good. That happened. The emotional response that should accompany the achievement doesn't arrive. Or it arrives so faintly that it barely registers, and they wonder, is something wrong with me? Why don't I feel this more? The same happens with sorrow. Something genuinely sad occurs, a loss, a disappointment, a moment that warrants grief, and they know intellectually that it's sad. They can identify that this should hurt, but the hurt feels distant, like it's happening to someone else. They want to cry and can't. They want to feel the full weight of the loss and can't access it. The emotion is there, but it's behind a wall they can't dismantle. Research on emotional blunting shows that the brain's response to suppression is systematic. When we repeatedly inhibit emotional expression, the neural circuits responsible for emotional experience start to quiet. It's not that the emotions disappear, it's that the connection between feeling and experiencing those feelings weakens. The signal is still sent, but it's not received with the same intensity. This creates a strange disconnection. They can tell you what they should be feeling. They understand emotionally appropriate responses, but they can't access the actual feeling. It's like knowing what a song sounds like but not being able to hear it, or knowing what food tastes like but not being able to taste it. The concept of the emotion is there. The experience of it isn't. Some days they're not sure if they're okay or just numb. If the calm they feel is genuine peace or emotional shutdown. If the lack of strong feeling is equanimity or dissociation. This uncertainty is deeply unsettling because it removes their ability to trust their own emotional experience. They've become so skilled at managing emotion that they've lost access to it. Joy feels muted because joy requires expression. Excitement requires sharing. Happiness amplifies when it's witnessed by others. But when you've spent years keeping positive emotions private, they lose their vibrancy. The promotion feels less significant when you tell no one. The achievement feels less real when you celebrate alone. Not because the accomplishment is smaller, but because human emotions are relational. They grow in connection and shrink in isolation. The same applies to difficult emotions. Sadness needs to be held. Fear needs to be spoken. Anger needs to be acknowledged. When these emotions are consistently suppressed, they don't just go away. They become ambient, a background hum of unprocessed feeling that never quite resolves, but never quite demands attention either. and that ambient emotional state becomes the new normal. Not quite okay. Not quite not okay, just there. This emotional muting can be particularly distressing because it affects their sense of self. Who am I if I don't feel things strongly anymore? Am I depressed? Have I lost something essential? The questions arise, but often without answers, because emotional muting doesn't fit neatly into diagnostic categories. It's not clinical depression, it's not anxiety, it's the natural consequence of long-term emotional containment. Some people who recognize this pattern try to force feeling. They seek out intense experiences hoping to break through the muting. But intensity without emotional safety often just reinforces the pattern. Because the emotions that do break through feel overwhelming after years of suppression, which reinforces the need for containment. And the cycle continues. Others simply accept the muting as permanent. They convince themselves this is maturity, that emotional intensity is juvenile, that feeling less is growing up. But this is rationalization disguising loss. Healthy emotional development includes access to a full range of feelings, intensity that can be felt and expressed without fear. The absence of that isn't growth, it's adaptation to circumstances that required emotional shutdown. The question surfaces quietly but persistently. Is this peace or is this numbness? Is this emotional regulation or emotional death? They don't know anymore. And not knowing becomes another layer of the isolation. Because how do you explain to someone that you can't feel properly? How do you describe the experience of being emotionally present but emotionally absent at the same time? Living with emotional muting means functioning but not thriving. It means getting through days but not enjoying them. It means watching your life happen but not fully inhabiting it. And this realization, when it comes, is devastating. Because protection came at a cost they didn't anticipate. They kept themselves safe from emotional pain. But in doing so, they also kept themselves from emotional aliveness. And now they're left wondering if reclaiming that aliveness is even possible. The answer isn't opening up to everyone. That would be overwhelming and unsafe, and it isn't staying permanently closed. That leads to the very isolation and muting that's causing suffering. The answer, uncomfortable and challenging as it is, lies somewhere in the middle, in learning what was never taught: discernment, selectivity, boundaries that filter rather than walls that block. Healing for people who keep things to themselves doesn't mean becoming an open book. It means learning to read themselves and their relationships more accurate. Learning to distinguish between people who are safe and people who aren't. Between moments when sharing serves connection and moments when privacy serves self-preservation. This skill, this discernment, is what many of them never developed. Because when all vulnerability felt dangerous, there was no reason to learn nuance. The first step is often the hardest. Accepting that complete self-sufficiency isn't actually strength. That needing support doesn't equal weakness. That asking for help isn't the same as being helpless. These concepts sound simple, but for someone whose identity has been built around not needing anyone, they're revolutionary, and accepting them requires dismantling beliefs that have felt true for decades. Selective sharing means not everyone gets access. Not every relationship needs deep emotional honesty. Some relationships are meant to stay surface level, and that's fine. The problem isn't having boundaries, it's having only walls. The work is learning the difference, learning that you can be private with some people and vulnerable with others, that different relationships can hold different levels of depth. This requires identifying who the safe people are. And safety isn't about perfection, it's about consistency. Do they show up? Do they listen without judgment? Can they hold difficult emotions without making them about themselves? Do they respect boundaries? These are the markers of relational safety. Not whether they never make mistakes, but whether they're trustworthy over time. For people who keep things to themselves, testing relational safety feels terrifying, because it requires sharing small things and observing how they're received. It requires saying, "I'm having a difficult day," and seeing what happens. Does the person ask follow-up questions with genuine care? Do they dismiss or minimize? Do they make space for the difficult feeling or change the subject? These microtests provide information about whether deeper sharing is safe. The practice is graduated disclosure, not sharing everything at once, not trauma dumping, but slowly, incrementally, testing the waters of vulnerability. Share something small. Notice the response. If it's met with care, share something slightly larger next time. If it's met with judgment or discomfort, maintain boundaries with the person. This is how trust is built. Not through one big reveal, but through repeated small experiences of being met with empathy. Another critical piece is learning to communicate needs without apologizing for them. This sounds simple, but is profoundly difficult for people who have learned that needs are burdens. The automatic preface is, "I'm sorry to bother you, but," or "I hate to ask, but," or "this is probably stupid." But these apologies aren't just polite. They're protective. They're attempting to make the need smaller so it's easier to reject if necessary. Healthy communication of need sounds different. "I need support right now. I could use someone to talk to. I'm struggling and I'd appreciate help." No apologies, no minimizing, just clear, honest expression of what's needed. This feels exposing, demanding, too direct. But it's actually just honest. And relationships that can't handle honest needs probably can't handle real intimacy either. Boundaries are another skill that needs development. People who keep things to themselves often operate in extremes, either complete openness or complete closure. But healthy relationships require boundaries that are flexible. Saying, "I need space right now," or "I can talk but I don't want advice, just listening," or "I'm sharing this but I'm not ready to process it fully yet." These are boundaries that allow partial presence without requiring full availability. Learning these skills feels like learning a new language. It's awkward at first. The words feel wrong. The vulnerability feels dangerous. But like any skill, it improves with practice. The first time sharing a need feels impossible. The 10th time feels slightly less impossible. The 100th time starts to feel almost natural. This is neuroplasticity, the brain forming new pathways for vulnerability. It's slow, but it's possible. What's crucial to understand is that this doesn't mean becoming emotionally dependent. It doesn't mean calling someone every time they feel something. It means allowing connection to exist alongside independence. It means being able to reach out when needed without it threatening their sense of self. This balance, this middle ground, is where healthy relationships actually live. There's also the practice of staying through discomfort. When they do share and then immediately regret it, the instinct is to withdraw, to shut down, to never share again. This is called vulnerability hangover, the aftermath of exposure, and it's temporary. Learning to stay engaged even when vulnerability feels uncomfortable is part of the process. Resisting the urge to disappear after being seen. None of this is quick, none of this is easy, and none of this happens without repeated experiences of safe vulnerability. One good interaction isn't enough to override years of learned silence, but 10 good interactions start to create new data. 20 interactions start to shift beliefs. Over time, with safe people who show up consistently, the equation changes. Vulnerability starts to equal connection instead of danger. Sharing starts to bring relief instead of regret. The goal isn't to erase privacy, it's to make privacy a choice rather than a prison, to keep some things sacred and private while allowing other things to be shared and witnessed. This selectivity, this intentionality, is what people who keep things to themselves often lacked. They learned total closure. They're now learning selective opening, and that's not weakness, that's wisdom, that's emotional maturity, that's healing. Another layer to this experience is grief for what was never shared. Grief for the moments that passed unwitnessed, the pain that was carried alone, the joy that wasn't celebrated, the support that was never requested. This grief is real, and it matters. Because living life without sharing it has costs that aren't always visible until you stop and take inventory. There's grief for unwitnessed suffering, the times they went through something genuinely difficult and no one knew. They handled it alone, and maybe they handled it well, but no one saw what it took. No one knew the weight of it. No one offered support because no one knew support was needed. And that invisibility, that going through pain as if it never happened because no one witnessed it, leaves a strange emptiness. Milestones experienced alone carry particular sadness. Graduations where they pretended to be fine while actually terrified about the future. Birthdays they spent managing others' expectations while feeling forgotten. Achievements they downplayed because celebrating felt too vulnerable. These moments happened, but they happened in isolation. And moments that aren't shared somehow feel less real, even though they were lived. There's also grief for relationships that stayed surface level when they could have been deeper. Friendships that lasted years without ever moving past pleasantries. Family connections that remained cordial but never intimate. Romantic relationships where they were physically present but emotionally absent. These relationships existed, but they didn't contain the depth that authentic sharing creates. They grieve the conversations that never happened. The late night talks where they could have been honest. The moment someone asked if they were okay and they said yes when the real answer was no. The opportunities to be vulnerable that they let pass because the risk felt too high. Each of these moments was a choice, and each choice was understandable. but together they add up to a pattern of disconnection that now feels like loss. This grief is complicated because it mixes sadness with relief, a sadness that they missed opportunities for connection, relief that they avoided the vulnerability those opportunities would have required, regret for staying closed, gratitude that staying closed kept them safe. It's not clean grief, it's ambiguous loss. Loss of connection that was never established. Loss of intimacy that was never allowed. Loss of being known in relationships where they were present but hidden. There's grief for the version of themselves that stayed unknown. The person they actually were beneath the performance. The struggles they carried that no one saw. The depth they possessed that they never revealed. That version of themselves existed fully only in private. And there's something lonely about being completely yourself, only when you're completely alone. They grieve moments they wish they could redo. Times when someone reached out and they pushed away. Times when support was offered and they declined. Times when they had a chance to be honest and chose protection instead. Not because those choices were wrong, but because now, in hindsight, they can see what might have been different if they'd chosen vulnerability. The grief extends to specific people. The friend who could have understood if they'd let them in. The partner who wanted to know them but was kept at distance. The family member who asked and eventually stopped asking. These people existed in their life, cared about them, but were never allowed close enough to witness the real them. And now, sometimes, it's too late. The relationship has ended. The person has moved on. The opportunity has closed. There's also grief for accumulated unshared moments, years of private processing, decades of carrying things alone, a lifetime of being the person who doesn't need help. When they finally recognize the cost of this pattern, they're looking back at years, sometimes decades, of disconnection. And that grief is vast, not acute like losing someone, but pervasive, like realizing you've been living a half life and the other half happened entirely unseen. This grief doesn't get acknowledged often because it's not socially recognized. There's no ritual for mourning relationships that stayed surface level. No ceremony for processing the loss of unshared experiences. No community support for grieving your own emotional isolation. So this grief, like everything else, gets held privately, which adds another layer to the loss. Even the grief about being alone is experienced alone. But this grief matters. Not because dwelling in it is the goal, but because acknowledging it is necessary. Acknowledging what was lost to self-protection, what was sacrificed for safety. The grief validates that the cost was real, that keeping things to yourself wasn't free, that privacy, while protective, came with profound loneliness. And acknowledging that doesn't mean it was wrong. It means it was hard, and that hardness deserves recognition. Some of this grief is mourning that's retrospective, looking back and seeing all the moments where connection could have happened but didn't. But some of it is grief about the present, about patterns that continue even now, about relationships that exist but don't contain depth, about the awareness that they're still living this way. still keeping things inside, still maintaining distance even when they wish they could close it. And this grief doesn't resolve by thinking about it. It resolves gradually through doing things differently, through allowing new experiences that aren't marked by isolation, through sharing when it's hard and discovering it doesn't destroy them, through building evidence that connection can exist without the cost they learn to expect. The grief is honoured by living differently, by allowing future moments to be witnessed, by choosing, slowly and deliberately, something other than silence. One of the most important realizations for people who keep things to themselves is this: keeping things inside was never a character flaw. It was a response, an adaptation to circumstances where vulnerability was genuinely unsafe. They're not broken for learning to protect themselves this way. They're intelligent. Their system did what it needed to do to survive. But now the circumstances have changed, or might have changed, and the adaptation that once protected them has become limitation. This realization is crucial because it shifts the framework from shame to compassion. They didn't fail by keeping things private. They survived. They managed. They found a way to function when emotional expression felt impossible. That deserves acknowledgement, not judgment. The pattern made sense. It still makes sense in certain contexts, but it doesn't need to be the only pattern forever. Staying closed off doesn't meet their needs either. This is the paradox. Protection was necessary, but permanent protection creates its own suffering. They kept themselves safe from potential rejection, but in doing so, they also kept themselves from potential connection. They avoided being hurt by others, but they hurt themselves through isolation. The math that made sense, keep things inside equals stay safe, eventually stopped working. Because safety without connection isn't actually safety. It's imprisonment. Connection doesn't have to hurt. But experiencing connection without hurt requires skills that many people were never taught. Skills that weren't modelled. Skills that weren't practiced because the environment didn't allow for them. And learning skills in adulthood that should have been learned in childhood is uncomfortable. Awkward. Sometimes humiliating. But it's possible. The first skill is communicating boundaries early instead of waiting until resentment builds. People who keep things to themselves often swing between total accommodation and total withdrawal. They say yes when they mean no. They tolerate discomfort until it becomes unbearable, and then they disappear. But healthy relationships require real-time feedback. I need to leave early. I can't take that on right now. I appreciate the invitation, but I need alone time. These small, honest communications prevent the build-up that leads to shutdown. Another skill is expressing needs without shame. I need support. I need space. I need someone to listen. These statements feel exposing. They feel like admitting weakness. But they're not weakness. They're human. Everyone has needs. The difference is that some people learned it was safe to express them, and others learned it wasn't. Relearning that expressing needs is acceptable, even necessary, is fundamental work. There's also the skill of tolerating vulnerability discomfort. When they share something real and then immediately want to take it back, that's normal. That's the vulnerability hangover. The instinct is to withdraw, to minimize what they said, to disappear. But healing requires staying, sitting with the discomfort, allowing themselves to have spoken truth even though it feels dangerous. Over time, this tolerance builds. The discomfort doesn't disappear, but it becomes survivable. Asking for help is another skill that requires practice. Can you help me with this? I don't know how to handle this alone. I could use your perspective. These requests feel enormous when you've spent years managing independently. But they're how interdependence happens. How relationships move from surface to depth. How trust is built, repeated experiences of asking and being met with care rather than judgment. There's also learning to notice resentment before it hardens into permanent distance. Resentment is information. It signals that a boundary was crossed or a need wasn't met. But people who keep things to themselves often ignore resentment until it's too late. Until the relationship feels unsalvageable. Learning to notice early, hey, that hurt, or I'm feeling taken for granted, prevents the accumulation that leads to cutting people off. Another crucial skill is allowing others to disappoint without internalizing it as confirmation that people are unreliable. Sometimes people mess up. Sometimes they're not available. Sometimes they say the wrong thing. That doesn't mean all vulnerability is dangerous. It means that person, in that moment, couldn't show up the way you needed. Healthy relationships require being able to navigate disappointment without it confirming your worst fears about connection. Most importantly, they need to learn that showing up imperfectly is better than not showing up at all. They don't have to have their feelings figured out before they share. They don't have to be articulate. They don't have to be composed. They can show up tired, confused, emotional, messy. Real connection happens in imperfection, not despite it. The performance of having it together prevents intimacy. The honesty of not having it together creates it. These skills feel impossible at first, because they require doing the thing that their entire system has been designed to prevent. But skills improve with practice. The first time asking for help might be agonizing. The 10th time might be merely uncomfortable. The 100th time might start to feel natural. This is neuroplasticity. New pathways forming, new possibilities emerging, slowly but emerging. The work isn't about becoming a different person, it's about adding options. They can still be private, they can still be independent, they can still handle things alone sometimes, but they're also developing the capacity to not handle things alone when they don't want to reach out when they need to be honest when it matters. That's not losing themselves, that's becoming more fully themselves. This work is hard because it requires learning what was never taught, because it means unlearning patterns that kept them safe, because it involves vulnerability without guarantee of positive outcome. But the alternative, staying exactly as they are, continuing to keep everything inside, continuing to live half-witnessed, that's hard too. Different hard. And at some point they have to choose which hard they're willing to face. Safety isn't something they find, it's something they create through consistent experiences of being vulnerable and being met with care, through relationships that prove, slowly and repeatedly, that sharing doesn't always lead to rejection, through building evidence that contradicts the old data, One interaction at a time, one honest moment at a time, one small risk at a time. That's how the equation changes. That's how keeping things to yourself transforms from survival strategy into conscious choice. That's how healing happens. Healing doesn't mean becoming an open book. It never meant that. It means learning to read the room and read themselves, learning when to share and when to stay private, learning who is safe and who isn't, learning that vulnerability is contextual, not absolute, that sometimes protection is still necessary, and that's fine, but protection should be a tool, not an identity, a choice, not a compulsion. The healing path doesn't require grand gestures. It doesn't require telling everyone everything. It starts small, with one safe person, one honest conversation, one moment of choosing connection over withdrawal. Not because they're afraid to be alone anymore, but because they're ready, even if scared, to be seen, even if imperfectly, even if it feels like unraveling, even if they don't know what will happen next. That first step is terrifying, because it's stepping into unknown territory without guarantee, without knowing if the person will stay or leave, without knowing if honesty will bring closeness or create distance. But it's also the only way forward, because the alternative, staying permanently closed, has already shown its limits. It protected them, but it also isolated them. And isolation, after a certain point, stops feeling like safety and starts feeling like slow disappearance. Finding that one safe person might take time. It might require observation. It might require small tests of sharing and seeing how it's received. But safe people exist. People who can hold difficult emotions, who don't make vulnerability about themselves, who stay when things get real instead of withdrawing into discomfort. These people aren't perfect, but they're consistent, and consistency is what creates safety. The practice looks like this. Share something small. I've been stressed lately. Notice the response. If it's met with genuine care, with questions that show interest rather than obligation, with presence rather than problem solving, that's a green flag. Share something slightly larger next time. The stress is about work. It's been overwhelming. Again, notice. Does this person stay engaged? Do they listen without judgment? Do they offer support without taking over? This graduated process allows trust to build naturally. It prevents the all-or-nothing pattern where they share everything at once and then feel exposed and regretful. It creates a foundation where vulnerability feels manageable because it's been tested in small doses first. And if someone doesn't respond well to small vulnerability, that's information. That person isn't safe for deeper sharing. And that's okay. Not everyone needs to be. Another part of healing is practicing sharing without apologizing. This is remarkably difficult for people who have learned that needs are burdens. The reflex is to minimize. I'm sorry to bother you. I know you're busy. This is probably nothing. But these apologies undercut the sharing. They make the emotion smaller before it's even been expressed. Practicing directness. I need to talk. I'm struggling and I need support feels aggressive at first. But it's not aggressive, it's honest. And honest communication is what creates real connection. There's also learning to stay present after sharing instead of immediately withdrawing. The vulnerability hangover is real. After opening up, the instinct is to disappear, to minimize what was said, to create distance. But healing requires staying engaged, tolerating the discomfort of having been seen, allowing the other person to respond. This sitting with vulnerability, this not running, is how new neural pathways form. How the nervous system learns that vulnerability doesn't always end in disaster. Part of the process is also grieving what was lost to silence. This grief is valid. Years of carrying things alone, relationships that stayed surface, moments that passed unwitnessed. That loss is real, and acknowledging it is part of moving forward, not dwelling in it, but honouring that the cost of keeping things inside was significant, and that choosing differently now doesn't erase what was lost then. The work is uncomfortable. It requires showing up in ways that feel unnatural. It requires trusting before trust feels certain. It requires being vulnerable before vulnerability feels safe. But discomfort is temporary. Isolation, if it continues, is permanent. And at some point, the discomfort of change becomes preferable to the pain of staying the same. When it works, when they share and they're met with care, something shifts. Not everywhere, not all at once, but in that relationship, with that person, a new possibility emerges. The possibility that connection doesn't always equal danger, that vulnerability can lead to closeness instead of rejection, that being seen can feel safe instead of threatening. That evidence, that lived experience of safe vulnerability is what changes everything. They don't have to become someone who shares everything with everyone. They don't have to sacrifice their privacy or their independence, but they can learn to open selectively, to trust strategically, to share where it matters. Not everywhere, not for everyone, but where it matters. And that's not weakness. That's not giving up who they are. That's becoming more fully human. That's learning to exist in relationships without disappearing into them or disappearing from them. The psychology of people who keep things to themselves isn't about being closed off or emotionally unavailable. It's about learning early that silence was safer than speaking, that holding things inside was less painful than risking rejection. That being the person who doesn't need anyone was easier than being the person who might be disappointed. This pattern made sense. It was protective, it was survival, and it worked for a long time, but it was never meant to be permanent. Keeping things inside was a response to circumstances that required it. A reasonable adaptation to an environment where vulnerability was genuinely dangerous. They didn't fail. They survived. They found a way to function when emotional expression felt impossible. That deserves recognition, not shame. The pattern made sense given what they learned, given what they experienced, given what they were taught about needs and emotions and connection. What it protected was their sense of self, their dignity, their control over their own experience. Keeping things private meant no one could use their vulnerability against them. No one could dismiss their feelings. No one could tell them they were overreacting or being too much. In that protection, there was real safety, real relief, real freedom from having to manage others' reactions to their internal world. But what it cost was equally real. It cost them witness, support, the experience of being fully known. It cost them relationships that could have gone deeper, moments that could have been shared, grief that could have been held by another person instead of carried alone. The cost wasn't obvious at first, but over time, over years of accumulation, the weight of unshared experience became its own burden. Different from the burden of vulnerability, but still heavy. The question underneath all of this, the question they've been carrying and avoiding in equal measure is this: can I be accepted as I actually am? Not as the capable version, not as the strong version, not as the person who has everything together, but as the human who struggles, who needs, who sometimes can't handle things alone. Can that version of me be loved? Can that version exist in relationship without being rejected? That question is terrifying because they're not sure of the answer, and uncertainty feels more dangerous than staying safe in what's known. So they've continued the pattern, continued keeping things inside, continued maintaining distance, not because they preferred it, but because the risk of finding out that connection might not be safe felt worse than the loneliness of certainty. But the path forward doesn't require them to open up to everyone. It doesn't require dismantling all their boundaries. It doesn't require becoming someone they're not. It requires finding one safe person, one relationship where honesty is possible, and testing slowly and carefully whether vulnerability leads to rejection or connection. Building evidence through experience. One moment at a time. This isn't about weakness. This isn't about giving up independence. This isn't about becoming needy or dependent or difficult. This is about learning that connection and autonomy can coexist, that needing support sometimes doesn't erase capability, that being private with most people and vulnerable with a few isn't hypocrisy. It's discernment, it's wisdom, it's knowing that different relationships hold different levels of depth, and that's okay. They didn't leave everyone behind because they're heartless. They kept things to themselves because sharing felt more dangerous than silence. They built walls not to keep people out but to keep themselves intact, to protect something that felt too fragile to expose, and for a long time those walls served them. But walls that once protected can become prisons, and realizing that doesn't mean the walls were wrong. It means circumstances have changed, or could change, if they let them. The work of healing is learning that staying connected doesn't require self-erasure, that sharing struggle doesn't mean losing strength, that admitting need doesn't mean becoming burdensome. These truths have to be experienced, not just understood. They have to be tested in safe relationships and confirmed through repeated evidence. That takes time. That takes courage. That takes willingness to risk vulnerability, even when every instinct says to protect. What's possible on the other side of that risk is a life that's witnessed, where suffering is held by more than just the person experiencing it, where joy is amplified through sharing, where relationships contain depth because honesty created space for it, where they don't have to choose between connection and authenticity, where they can be themselves fully and discover that being themselves doesn't lead to rejection, at least not with people who matter, not with people who are actually safe. They don't disappear anymore, not into themselves, not from others. They don't overgive to earn their place. They don't perform strength to maintain value. They don't vanish to feel safe. They stay, not everywhere, not with everyone, but where it matters, with people who have proven, through consistency and care, that they can hold honesty without weaponizing it, that they can witness struggle without running, that they can be present for the real human underneath the facade. And that's not weakness, that's not failure, that's not giving up who they are. That's courage wearing a quieter face. That's strength that's finally allowed to rest. That's protection that's evolved into connection. That's learning that maybe, just maybe, the answer to the question they've been avoiding is yes. They can be accepted as they actually are. Not by everyone, but by someone. And sometimes someone is enough.